So we ended last Thursday, with a claim. I ended the lecture with a claim about opportunity being good for people, right? And that opportunity being a set of circumstances. That opportunity, the wrong way to use opportunity was to use it to explain big differences in social or economic outcomes. And that if we get disciplined about keeping a definition of opportunity as circumstances, right? Small, local, immediate circumstances, kinds of things that are opened up by that, then it becomes less like a platitude, opportunity is good for people, and more like a question, which is, how do we construct opportunity for people? How do we build circumstances for people? Well, circumstances for what? And I was trying to just put a stake in the ground around the idea that an opportunity for learning, not just an opportunity for advancement, but an opportunity for learning, right? Advancement and learning aren't the same thing. It doesn't mean that learning can lead to advancement, but they're not the same thing. Okay? Not only an opportunity to climb whatever ladders there are, but an opportunity to explore and discover. The minute that we open it up into exploration and discovery, we also get something else, which is not just the acquisition of skills or knowledge, but also the discovery of things like who you are and who you're meant to be. Some of you won't figure that out ever. Most of you will figure it out sometime. My hope is that it comes from my own child sooner rather than later. And that whatever definition she has of who she is, or whatever definition he has of who he is flexible, that it can change over time, right? That it's not limited by the dumb cages we put around people's pathways, the stupid fences we put around where people can go. Some of you hear that as idealism. I hear it actually as realism. People can change, right? So why decide in advance what that change has to look like, All right, I don't want this to become a motivational speech, but I do want to make a point about this, which is just a kind of a course correction. I'm using course in two ways, right? Course, our course, but also course like our trajectory, a course correction. I want to be very clear about what my claim is that I want you to think about, right? My claim is not that we could either make learning like a ladder, right? Or the pathway for learning like a ladder, or we could make the pathway for learning like a tree or a leaf. This is not take your choice. Learning works like this. That's my claim. Learning in the wild, the learning that we're evolved to do, what we can do without even having to think about it, if we were to map it out, it would look more like a tree or a leaf. So that's not about, sometimes it's like a ladder, sometimes like it's always like a leaf. It's always like a tree. The pathway for your own learning in the wild is like a tree. So when we decide to organize the circumstances for learning in a linear pathway or like a ladder, what we're doing, and this is where Hawkins comes in, we're deciding to cut off the branches. It is not sometimes it's a ladder, sometimes it's a leaf. The question is, should we cut off the branches to learning? Because they're there before we get there. They're available unless we make them unavailable. Exploration is going to happen unless we say that it won't. Discovery is what we do unless we're denied the opportunity to do so. So the question that I want you to ask yourself about learning is not, should it be a ladder or should it be a leaf? I want it to be very specific. Should we cut off the branches? And the answer very well might be yes under some circumstances. But then define those circumstances. Okay. The next thing, which is what lecture is about today, and it's partly what I wanted to prime you for by having you write about your own experience, is another claim that I want you to consider. The last claim was opportunity is good for people, right? As long as we define opportunity as real-world circumstances. The next claim is democracy is good for people. So the rest of today is going to be about democracy. In the next 5 minutes, what I'd like you to do is on that blank piece of paper I already asked you to take out, I'd like you to draw a picture of what democracy looks like. How would you know democracy if you saw it, right? If you're an artist, cool. If you just draw stick figures, cool. But I want you to draw a real-world scene where you'd say, yeah, this is what democracy looks like. Okay? And if you want to annotate it, that's fine too. But draw the picture first. Make sure your name's on it, along with your TA or your section time. On your mark, get set, go. You got 5 minutes. What did you see that was interesting? You guys see anything that made you go, oh, right on, or oh, that made me think, or something? Yes?
There's a difference between what democracy should be and how it actually is.
There's a difference between what democracy should be and what it actually is. So an ideal definition versus a practice. Okay? Let me say this. Let me define that differently. I got 4 people to go. I want you to write this down, note takers. There's a difference. I want to change that a little bit. Oh, look at y'all. All of you are note takers. I didn't expect you all to do it. There's a difference between what democracy is and what we call democracy. How about that? How about that being a difference? Not what democracy should be and what it is, because I don't want to get into this ideal versus practical. What today is going to be about largely is getting a definition of democracy that's not should or is, but what democracy is, and then we get to say, well, what we call democracy might not actually be democracy. Okay? Some firm boundaries. All right, a few more people. What did you see? You notice there's a difference between what democracy is and what we call democracy, yes?
My partner has like a big person drawn and then a bunch of little people, so like the state representative, I guess.
Ah, nice. A big person and then a bunch of little people. Which do you want to be? It depends, right? If it's a lot of work, maybe the little person. If the pay is good, maybe the big person. So a big person and little person. Okay? Yes?
I had the same thing where it was in a triangle.
Huh.
It had like a kind of hierarchical concept of
Gorgeous, kind of a hierarchy, right? The people produce a leader or a representative. 2 more. I told you I might cold call today. Yes. This is this is nice. You guys are the gifted group. Maybe these are the people we should elect to represent the rest of you. This group right here, they're clearly more capable and more involved. I'm kidding, right? You know that. Yes.
She had a flow chart from like a group of people to the White House to make a law. So
Nice. A flow chart, a group of people from make to the White House. Those of you who hate our president for one reason or another, I don't care, that you might really reject that, but maybe it was the Capitol building, whatever. Some building and then the law. You guys ever watch Schoolhouse Rock? Yeah, it's so funny. You guys are like, yeah, Schoolhouse Rock, of course. Because it's got a comeback, right? You guys know the song, right? I'm a Bill, you know I'm a Bill. And I'm sitting on the steps here on Capitol Hill. That was the time where when I had the remote when I was a kid, I was like, click. I wish they'd play conjunction, junction, what's your function? Because that's a groove. There was a hand up over here somewhere. Yes? I didn't hear you. Can you speak a little louder? I heard the first part, a group of people. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Was that what democracy is or what democracy isn't? What democracy is, all right. I'd be a fool to pretend that you haven't already got somewhere in your head or hearts, probably in your heads or in your conversations or in the news or on whatever feed you get, or even just if you pay attention to whatever the most recent campaign is, or whatever the most recent justification has been for going to someplace else and fighting a war. I'd be a fool to imagine that you don't already have in your head some definition of democracy. So let me be clear. The definition of democracy that I'm going to propose today may not fit with what you say democracy is or what you think democracy is. I don't anticipate changing your mind, but I do want you to consider the definition that I'm going to offer, okay? I don't want to be apologetic, but I want to be clear. Okay? Yes?
Do you think it's possible, though, that the definition of democracy has changed since it first, like, maybe democracy is now how it is in the US?
You hear that? Maybe the definition's changed, right? Maybe democracy is now what it is now. The danger in going there is then we get to say, right, democracy is whatever we call democracy. Which kind of lets, unless we're willing to say democracy is whatever we call democracy. And what you call democracy is not really democracy, right? You see how the danger you get in? That the definition of democracy's changed. So, I get it, man. I'm all for, like, let's look at what we actually do and see what we call it. But we do get in a kind of morass where it becomes self-justifying, right? Democracy is what people call democracy, but people call a lot of different things democracy. So if that's what it is, then we got to say, well, who are we going to let call democracy? Like, who are we going to listen to? Usually that means us. Democracy is what we call democracy. If there were a way to think of a totally different term, I would be all for it, because it would make this class, this lecture in particular, and my life worrying about what kind of society I want for myself and my children, it would make all of that a lot easier if I could just find a new word. Unfortunately, democracy, I think, is the right word. Okay? But let's not yet say democracy is what we call democracy, and see if we can get down to a definition that gives us some intellectual power, some leverage. Okay, first, and this will be quick, what are we talking about when we talk about democracy, right? So I'm talking about democracy as a way of making decisions. That's all. That's all. That's a big deal, right? Democracy as a way of making decisions, right? Sometimes those decisions are decisions for oneself, right? They're about me. But by and large, where the whole thing gets difficult is when we're talking about making decisions for other people, right? So democracy is a way of talking about making decisions that affect us and other people. Look at your child. I told you to take your child out. Look at your child. So when we talk about democracy, we're talking about a way of making decisions for your child. Okay, let's be clear about why we're talking about democracy. Okay, not distant, not across some ocean, but as a practical matter of how we're going to make decisions about what your child gets, what your child can do, the circumstances your child will find him or herself in. Okay? Democracy is a way of making decisions that affect your child. That could be small. Like, for example, I have a minivan. And those of you who are saying to yourselves, especially boys, I will never own a minivan. Man, minivan is like a cave on wheels. It's the best. I have a minivan. Kids are in the back, and there's one Cliff Bar in the car, and they're all hungry, right? How are we going to make that decision? I'm always going to be usually it's the two girls who are fighting, although now Zeke's in on it too. Like I could be the tying vote or the breaking vote, or if it's voting. Seriously, it could be that simple. How are we going to make decisions? It could also be, how do we make decisions about where our tax money goes? How do we make decisions about what the uniform code will be? Whether or not people have to wear a uniform at the school? It could be a decision about just about anything. All right, so democracy, when we're talking about democracy, what I mean is a way of making decisions, okay, that affect other people, okay? First, what democracy isn't, okay? Bless you. I don't know, do you say bless you on a hiccup? What is the proper response on a hiccup? I don't know. Sorry. That must have hurt. What democracy isn't. Democracy isn't, the way we answer the question about what democracy isn't is by having another question, it says making decisions. Who is making decisions? So these are answers to the question of who makes decisions that are not democracy. Got it? These are answers to the questions of who make decisions that are not going to count as democracy. Anything, right? This is a little etymology lesson. Like this means rule or govern, right? The latter part of this. Autocracy, right? Autocracy. I'm going to use that as a big category that looks like this. One person deciding for everybody else, right? So I'm sitting in my minivan, right? Most of the time it's pretty autocratic. I decide. I'm in the driver's seat, literally and figuratively. There are lots of different versions of an autocracy just being one person. Here are some of the options over here on the right. A monarchy, where the person who's making decisions is believed to have some almost sacred right to it, an inherited right to make decisions, right? Or maybe they've won enough battles that they get to name themselves king or queen. When there's one person making decisions for a bunch of people, it's an autocracy, and one version of that is a monarchy. A dictatorship is not like a monarchy, right? Maybe they call themselves, the person calls him or herself king or queen, but a dictatorship might give us a different kind of image, but really it's one person making decisions, right? The name dictatorship or dictator is most often these days used for North Korea, for what it's worth, right? 20 years ago, that might not have been the case. Fidel Castro was called a dictator until he wasn't. But let's not pretend we don't know what a dictator is, right? At least in this common use. Despotism, I'll skip because it's not as interesting as the fourth one, which is a theocracy. Now, a theocracy could either be an autocracy or what we call an oligarchy. But there is a version of a theocracy, and I'll put these words together, that is autocratic, which is one person, right, is the designated by God to represent God to the people and people to the God, or gods. A theocracy, that's about, it's a religious, it's references to God or gods, right? Now, these are not, the boundaries between these are not hard and fast, and frankly, it's not that important. That is, you could have somebody who's a king or queen, but who takes that title based on some perceived or declared religious right. Okay? All right, but these are different versions of what we might call an autocracy. There's another thing that's not democracy. That's a different answer to the question of who gets to decide. Remember, that's what it is. Who gets to decide? One person for everybody else, right? But in this case, we'll change the etymology a little bit. This is Greek, right? Rule or government by a few. Okay, this comes from the Greek archos, which is archos, which is rule or government by the few. Okay, so that would look something like this. A few. Not one, but a few. Now, this is where it gets complicated because the idea, what we call democracy, is often an oligarchy. Right? We use the word democracy to describe what is probably more accurately called an oligarchy. In this case, a theocracy. Remember what I said the last time? You could have, for example, a priestly class of people. People who are the religious designees, right? Designated by God to make decisions for the rest. Not just one person, but a sort of sacred few. You could also have an aristocracy, right? Which is that you have a few people who deserve it, right? But they deserve it really because they're kind of better people. We use the word aristocracy to talk largely about rich people, right? But really it means sort of the more beautiful people, the more deserved people, the better people, ruled by the better people. Right? A plutocracy, a technocracy. This is one we come across all the time. And there's an accusation that what we're turning into in the United States is a technocracy, where decisions are made by the people who know better. Right? It's not about that I'm a better person, but I've studied the problem, and I know what you need. Right? A technocracy ruled by the technical elite, the people who know better, who are more skilled. This is not about rule by technology, which sometimes can be a mistake people make. This is ruled by the people who know better. So when I say, what do we need? I don't know, let's call the expert. That doesn't mean democracy doesn't include a reliance on other people's knowledge, but they're not necessarily making decisions in a democracy, right? So democracy is against people who claim or actually do know more, have more knowledge, making decisions for the rest. That would be an oligarchy, where the people who are the few are the people who know better. And the last one would be a meritocracy. Now this is where it gets super complicated, and I'm going to put a stake in the ground on this one because for many, many people, a meritocracy, that word conjures up good images. Right? A meritocracy. That is, the people who rule are the people who've earned it. It's merit. Merit-based scholarships, right? Now, I'm not saying this, I'm not against merit-based scholarships. I'm just saying if we take democracy seriously, we have to acknowledge, right, that one alternative to democracy would be ruled by a few, right? But those few are determined by those who somehow have earned it. Now, how do you earn something? You either earn it because you're smarter, for example, better. Sounds a little bit like an aristocracy, right? But it conjures up like the people who work hard, right? And we use meritocratic ideals, not a meritocracy, meritocratic ideals, as a way of describing who should get into college, why you should have the seat that you have. You deserve it. Man, pat yourself on the back. Most of you worked really hard to get here. Some of you worked harder than others. So what? Y'all worked. It's very rare that you got where you got simply by chance. You had to try. I want to be realistic, of course. I think we should all be realistic and recognize that there are an awful lot of people who worked really hard who aren't here. Not just because they don't want to be here, We might also have to be honest with ourselves and say, you know what? Actually, I was in leadership and I got to leave school at lunchtime. Or, I worked really hard, but if I was late to school, I was getting tight with the attendance clerk and she'd write me a note. Acknowledge that it's not as simple as I worked hard. Maybe you got some breaks along the way. But those don't undermine the basic fact that you probably got where you got because of your work. You worked hard at it. And there's something that's deeply connected to our sense of self and the American dream, which is that, man, if you work hard, you can get what you want. You can be what you can be. Go watch a motivational speech by Les Brown or Tony Robbins or Kevin Thomas, I think this guy's name is, like any of these sports motivational videos. Just watch them, man. They fire you up. You get what you get if you try hard. Wake up in the morning, rise and shine. Welcome to the grind. Because you can. And there's something deeply, deeply true about that. That if you work hard, that if you set yourself, right, if you set your mind to it, not just your mind to it, because if you listen carefully, it's not just setting your mind to it, it's setting your body, your feet, your fingers, your everything to it. If you don't press snooze on the alarm clock, you've heard the motivational speeches, you probably run them through when you're feeling especially low. If you don't press snooze on the alarm clock, put your feet down, you could probably, make of life whatever you want to make of it. And we should tell our kids that too. Just yesterday, I told my own kid, you can do whatever you want. Who's anybody else to tell you that you can't? You could be, I found myself sounding like an armed forces recruitment ad. Be all you can be. Reach for the stars. It sounded so cliche, but it's true. The question is not whether or not the people who work hard should get whatever they've worked hard for. The question is, who do we want making decisions for us? Do you want somebody making a decision for your child? Your child being cut out of that decision to some degree by somebody who deserves it better? Or maybe better this, do you want decisions being made in favor of the people who deserve it versus the people who don't? Not just who makes decisions, but for whom will the decisions get made? So if you're getting screwed by the decisions we make, maybe it's because you deserve to get screwed. Not just who makes decisions, but for whom do decisions get made. If you don't pull your own weight, sorry, tough luck. I don't see you looking for a job. Maybe you deserve to not have a house. Those are all versions of a meritocratic ideal. But let's be clear that a meritocracy is not the same thing as democracy. Not just are they not the same thing, but they are in fact deeply opposed to one another. And if that means that you no longer fight for democracy, you fight for meritocracy, cool, then do so with eyes wide open. Because if democracy, so what is democracy? I got this democracy isn't, and I'll get to what democracy is in a minute. More of what democracy isn't. All right? So it's not those things. It's not ruled by one or ruled by a few. It's also not voting. If this doesn't ring a bell to you, then go read Paul Woodruff, right? It was assigned for last Thursday. If you didn't read it before you go on Gaucho Space and say, Jason's full of shit. Just go read Woodruff, please. Right? He's making a claim about what the ideal form of democracy is, right? And he's saying, democracy in its most basic radical form, radical meaning root form, not radical, think of the word radical like radish, like radical at the root. In its root form, democracy is not voting. Although that seems close. All right, so what else isn't democracy according to Woodruff? Democracy isn't majority rule. Now, not rule by a few, but rule by the majority. Right? If you've studied anything in poli-sci, I hope you have some required course. It's been a long time since I read Tocqueville, but right? Listen, you guys know the phrase, tyranny of the majority? How easy is it when you're in a majority to say, hey man, that's how the cookie crumbles. That's how that Cliff Bar in the back seat crumbles. Man, you lost, right? Me and Zeke voted for us to have the Cliff Bar, and Salah, you got to have your Cliff Bar later. Majority rule, right? Tyranny of the majority. That feels okay. It feels okay to have it be majority rule unless you're always in the minority. And that's something that alerts us to how that doesn't feel quite right. Right? Usually voting and majority rule go together. And we say, let's take a vote. It's a democracy. You'll hear these words used all the time. Just because we call voting democracy and we call majority rule democracy doesn't mean that that's what democracy is. I'm not saying you can't use the term however you like, but understand that. At least be more specific. You could at least be a little more exacting. Then when you say voting, don't say it's democracy, say let's vote. Because it's quick. If it's majority rule, say let's make it be majority rule, because it's quick. Let's not call it democracy. Democracy isn't voting. Democracy isn't majority rule. Wow, that's starting to get scary. Democracy also isn't this. That may be the best we can do in our aiming for democracy. Democracy isn't, if we pay attention to Woodruff and his claims, and I want to borrow them for our purposes, democracy isn't voting somebody else to represent us. Or it's not even really having somebody chosen. Because there's other ways to choose representatives. That's not just voting. We could have a lottery. It's your turn. You're picked now. You're our representative. That may be the best we can do. But let's be cautious when we say, because it's the best we can do, that's what we mean when we say democracy. Woodruff has a great image. He has a great image. He says, democracy is like a North Star. You're never going to get there. But it gives you a way, it gives you a direction to head. It gives you something to aim for. And it gives you a way to measure whether or not you're on or off course. Those of you who are ready to say, we're never going to get democracy, so let's stop talking about it, you know what? Then you and I just are coming from basic different positions. I'm not troubled by the fact that our society will never fulfill everybody's hopes and dreams. But golly, it's worth trying. And that's where you get into the cliche stuff, I know. What is it? Aim for the, what is it? Shoot for the moon? You've heard the expression? What is it? I don't remember what it is because I don't use it. Shoot for the moon. Yeah, something. Yeah, it's funny how much of an impact it had on you, like it did on me. Like shoot for the moon, stars, whatever. Something like shoot for the moon. If you fall short, you'll land in the stars. And then people learn astronomy, and they're like, actually. But it's a good point, right? But the point with democracy being a North Star is it gives us something to aim for. We're not even trying to. It gives us a way to understand if we're on or off track. So this is the one that's most troubling when we get to Woodruff, because Woodruff is saying that representation, a representative government, is not the same as democracy, even if that's the best we can do. Because then we can say, all right, so can we tweak this to make it more like what we want? All right, so that's what democracy isn't. This one is not in any of your readings, but note takers, actually everybody, this would be fun to write down. I'm not going to test you if you write it down. Note takers, be sure this gets in the notes. It's going to be on the slideshow. This comes from a guy named John Keane, who just recently wrote a book, last 4 or 5 years, on democracy. And he says, and I think this is useful, not just what democracy isn't and what democracy is, but what is democracy against? And this is just such an evocative phrase, and we're going to use it a lot. And if we don't use it a lot in our words, I'm going to use it a lot in my head. And I want you to try it out. Democracy is against talk of gods and nature and rulers claiming privileges based on superiority of brains or blood. That cuts out almost all of the other options, right? It would be against talk of gods and nature and rulers, talk of anybody claiming privileges based on superiority of brains or blood. So the easy one is the last one, superiority based on blood. And they're not talking about blood type or health. They're talking about who you are, what family you come from. That's a pretty revolutionary move. It may feel not so revolutionary now. That's pretty revolutionary, saying just because you were born into a family with certain rights and privileges means that you should have them and nobody else should. Right? That seems easy to say. That doesn't sound right. But also brains. That's the one that gets harder for us, right? It's against anybody, gods, nature, rulers, claiming privileges based on superiority of brains. Those people who got all uptight because George W. Bush, who was president, I don't know, for some of you when you were little kids, saying he didn't deserve to be president because he didn't score straight A's when he was at Yale. troubles that easy sense of course, the smart people should be the ones. That your privilege of making decisions for me is based on the superiority of your brain, that you're smarter. In that piece by John Dewey, right, that I hope you read about democracy, written right around World War II when the world was facing a genuine threat that may seem far off. In the late 1930s, the world was facing a genuine threat of fascism being how everybody rolled. I don't mean to be sort of casual about it, but fascism as being a real and viable way of organizing a society. He dispenses with fascism, John Dewey does. He dispenses with fascism pretty quickly, but what does he do? He tells a story about a woman who tells him that she went to an American statesman and said, if you had to make decisions for somebody, what would you do? And what did the statesman say? He said, I would take a very deep look at the matter and try to assess what the person needed, and then I would try to give that person what she needed. And she says, in the story that John Dewey tells, she says, I kind of thought you'd say that. But I was hoping you'd say, well, I would ask. I would ask somebody to represent their own needs and wants. Not, I'm in a better position to see what you need than the position you're in. Okay, so this is what it's against. Talk, gods and nature and rulers claiming privileges based on superiority of brains or blood. Okay, so now finally, what democracy isn't, what it's against, so what is democracy? Go back to this question, who? Everybody. It means the people who are involved in the decision making, right? And this is now a difference, not the people who make decisions, but people who are involved in the decision making process is everybody. Right? As the North Star version of democracy. Everybody. Which means all of your children, you, whether you're smart, whatever that takes, whether you're accomplished, whether you've got a college degree or never finished grade school, whether you're the guy right outside the lecture hall this morning who was clearly distressed about the way the janitor had treated him. The easy thing for me to say walking in would have been, man, that guy's got, he's not quite right. Maybe he needs some help. That guy too. All the people in every single car that you're driving on the freeway next to, including the person who cut you off and looked at you like you did something wrong and went like this. Right? Or wait, usually it's like that. And that person too. Including the abusers and the victims, the rich and the poor, the unstable and the stable, whatever those mean, the accomplished and the not, the fast and the slow, and the medium. Democracy is the word we use when it's decision making by everybody for whom those decisions might or might not matter. Which means, it even means that you get to be involved in the decision making for me, even if it doesn't involve you directly, even if you're not going to be really that impacted by it. Now, clearly not every decision can be made democratically. But let's, what decisions, so that we will limit it to the decisions that affect most of us. Democracy says, the principle of democracy, demo, the people. Now, the Athenians didn't get everybody in the whole society in a room. How big would that room have to be? Right? But that was the aim. There was a hand up somewhere. Yes?
I understand that, but I don't understand how that doesn't naturally tend towards majority rule.
Say more.
Well, it seems like if everyone's making the decision, like whether or not, we can consider the minority,
Sure.
but probably the majority is going to end up being the one who decides. because maybe the effects of some decision on the minority will be considered, but in most cases, the majority
Sure.
decision is going to prevail.
It's marvelous, and what you pointed out is what democracy, one of the other slides later, which is what does democracy demand, this kind of democracy, what does it demand? And if democracy begins, if the starting point is, you know what you need, I know what I need, that's not going to change, whose needs are going to get met now, then sure enough, right?
Yeah.
The people, the majority for whom, right, the majority whose needs are going to get, they're going to be the ones deciding. But there's another way of conceiving of that principle, which is that when you and I meet in a democratic encounter, your needs might change as soon as you hear about mine. That what you want might be different once you hear what I want. So the possibility of movement disrupts the easiness with which we say, well, it's just going to end up a majority rule. I agree with you, actually. If what it is we all come in and say, all right, who wants what? And then what do? You go, well, let's vote, right? And then you get majority rule. All right, so for it to be democracy, what does it demand of us? And this is where we're headed, and this is where we get to the how. Well done, you took me right into the next slide, the how. Because really the what, the who, and the what, and that's the easy part. That's the easy part when we talk about democracy. So how? How does it work? So how do we do it so it doesn't end up like majority rule? How do we do it so we don't go, man, screw it, I don't know how to do this. Can we just vote? Driving in the front seat of my minivan, trust me, that's exactly how I solve the problem. Either I take control, I say, I'm going to decide for you, or we say, let's vote. I'm tired of being up on stage. Makes you all crane your necks. So how? And this is where John Dewey gives us some good stuff, I think. Right? You say, this is his how. He says, mutual conference and consultation, putting together all these individual expressions of ideas and wants. Right? Mutual conference and consultation. Mutual conference, getting together, right? Talking it out. Now those of you who, when you see that, the only image you can come up with is of people holding hands and lighting candles and singing Kumbaya and saying things like, I feel what you're saying, or saying, you know what, all we need is just a bunch of I statements. Yes, I need X. Or maybe we do a whole nonviolent communication approach. When you cut me off on the freeway, that made me feel very angry. Can you agree not to cut me off on the freeway? Like, that's softening the sharp edges. There's nothing soft about this. Mutual conference and consultation, putting together these individual expressions of ideas and wants. And here's really the nut of it, right? The give and take, the exchange of experiences and ideas. In its simplest form, that just means getting everything out on the table. Just getting it all out on the table, right? In its very simplest form. And frankly, that's pretty easy, right? And the way we solve the danger of the majority rule problem is by just spreading the sacrifice around. So if you got to give something up next time, right? Maybe the next time I have to give something up, right? It's called compromise. In its simplest form, democracy just demands compromise. But let's be clear, for that compromise to work, it can't be a one-shot deal. For that compromise to work, it's got to be over a long haul. Because you got to believe, for this to work, right? So in the first place, democracy demands what? A mutual encounter, a give and take of exchange and the exchange of experiences and ideas. But what else? Okay, so what? Well, it demands some time, right? Because we have to have a chance for you to get what you want if it's just going to be simple compromise, at the very least. Right? You have to believe. We have to have enough time so that you can believe in good faith that if you give up what you want this time, there's a chance you'll get it next time. Here's something that's totally corrosive to democracy, is that if you're always being the one asked to sacrifice. And it's the people who are frequently in the majority who say, no, that works. Majority rule is just fine. Right? It sucks to be the one who's always being asked to sacrifice. That's corrosive to the give and take of ideas and experiences, because if every time you put your ideas on the table, you're pretty sure it's not going to matter, why would you ever put them on the table? Why would you? I wouldn't. If every time I say, this is what I need, this is what I want, if I suspect, even not every time, if I suspect that probably it's not going to matter, I'd be a fool to keep laying it out there. Usually what happens is that people go, I'm not going to be involved. It's not going to matter. It's not going to matter if I say what I need and want anyway. Forget forms of government. You've heard teachers say this is a democratic classroom. But if what you want the course to do never changes the direction of the course, pretty soon you stop raising your hand. And you stop asking questions. And you stop saying, I don't like that. And you stop saying, this is not the direction we need to go. So the give and take. So at the very least, we get to the question like, what does democracy demand? At the very minimum, it involves time, right? It involves engagement. And it involves some trust. It involves some trust that sacrifice will get distributed kind of evenly. I give up something this time, you give up something next time. That's democracy in its simplest form, right? Or at its most basic, demand for compromise. But that's not why we're talking about democracy today. That's not why I'm talking to you about democracy and sometimes shouting, sometimes dancing around the stage. That's not why I care about it. That's not why John Dewey cared about it either. Democracy is a name for the way that we might engage with each other that might make us move. It's not just sometimes you get what I want, sometimes I get what I want. It's that if I have to measure my needs and wants against yours, there's a chance that my needs and wants will be different. Think of it this way. I can't see everything that there is to see. I can't ask everything that there is to ask. I can't possibly want everything that there is to want. You and what you see and ask and want are going to be different than what I ask and want. So the commitment to democracy, on the one hand, is a commitment to a form of government. I get it, and maybe we always fall short, so we go voting is fine. But a commitment to democratic engagement is a commitment, frankly, to movement and change. And that's where the sharp edges stay sharp. Because in the end, it's not just sometimes you get what you want and sometimes I get what I want, but sometimes neither of us get what we wanted at the beginning because we turn out wanting something different at the end. In this way, democracy is an educational principle. And that's Dewey's big point. Engaging with each other democratically, it's not what it gives us, it's what it demands of us. If in the expression of the give and take, the exchange of experiences and ideas, right? If I have to put my experiences and ideas up against your ideas and experiences, it's going to demand movement. In this way, democracy is a way of educating our imagination. And I took the slide out and put it back in, because a lot of the times when we think of imagination, we think of like Disneyland or something. It's like, rainbows and My Pretty Pony. I have no idea where that reference came in. It's like, imagine. Reach for the stars kind of language. The reason that democracy is an educational principle is because my imagination is necessarily limited by my own experience. So that when I say this is what I want, this is what everybody wants, right? When I say this worked for me, I say that's what's going to work for you. This isn't because we've done something wrong. This is just how it works. When we're left alone, our imagination is confined and constrained by our own experience. So we look at our child and what do we see? We see us. We say gate classes worked for me. My child will be in gate classes. standardized testing in spring worked out swell for me, it should be no problem for my child. Having a coach that yells to make you go faster, that made me go faster. So that's what I imagine working for my child. Then we hear of somebody who says, yeah, remember that coach who yelled at me? I never played that sport again. And if we let our imagination stay atrophied and small, what do we say? We go, maybe you're just not cut out for it. The demand of a democratic encounter would be, wait a second, you're saying that coach's yelling didn't work for you? Maybe coach's yelling doesn't work. Even if it worked for me, but the fact that it didn't work for you, maybe that's not because you're not strong enough. Maybe it's because it doesn't work for you. You say, well, the school system's fine. It worked for me. I got here. Democracy doesn't demand that you sit around and talk to other people who are in the seats next to you. It demands you talk to the people and exchange the give and take of experiences and ideas with the people who got cut out. And they say, it didn't work for me. Schooling did not work for me. And democracy would demand that you don't go, well, maybe you're just not cut out for school. It's where you go, wait a second, maybe it doesn't work. The give and take of experiences and ideas and wants and needs at its most significant effect is the demand that we extend our imagination into the experiences and ideas of other people. Some of you will never do this until you fall in love with somebody. Some of you won't do this until you have the kind of intimacy that you don't feel threatened by other people's wants and needs. Some of you won't ever do this at all. But the democratic ideal says when we encounter other people, we will encounter lots of other people. When we're making decisions about what to do next that affect other people, we will consult other people, and we will consult lots of people. When deciding what works in school, we won't talk to the people for whom school worked. We'll talk to the people for whom school didn't work. When saying what an ideal teacher is, we won't just ask the people who nailed school, we'll ask the people who didn't nail school. I became a teacher because of my 5th grade teacher. He was my 5th and 6th grade teacher. I won't tell you his name because of the way this story goes. During the summers, he hired me to go, he was building a boat. It was like a kind of a Moby Dick story, right? I mean, he was building a boat out of concrete. Imagine my 5th grade brain going, wait, a boat out of concrete? Turns out boats can be made out of concrete. I worked on his boat every summer. He and his wife made me soup for breaks. He had a motorcycle. It wasn't weird. Some of you already are like, that seems weird. Right? In 1976 or 7, or when was I 10? 1980? 1978 to 80. Rapper's Delight had just come out. It was a different time and it was awesome. And I did so well in his class. He gave me my very first really bad grade because he caught me plagiarizing. I used the word usurp in a sentence. And he called me in and he said, can you tell me what usurp means? And I said, I have no idea. He said, why did you use it? It's because I found it in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And he said, you get an F on this paper. It's amazing. Fast forward, I'm teaching 5th grade. He worked for me. I'm in my 5th grade classroom in Carpinteria, Maine Elementary School. It's now not a school, it's Maine Elementary School. I was in the classroom I was standing in, and this guy, I turn and he's standing at the door. Can you imagine, right? My heart swelled, and I got super nervous, right? I couldn't help but call him Mr. Well, hello, Mr. And they're like, wait, you're Mr. Raley, what? And he came and he sat, and then later on he said, I got to go. It was this amazing experience, and he left me a note. And maybe he sent me the note. I don't remember. And it said, it was such a pleasure to be in your class today. You're going to be amazing. You don't need my words of wisdom. But I'm going to give you some advice that you may not know you need. Be careful of the black kids. They're going to give you a hard time. The Jews and the Asians will do well. Focus on them. And then I remembered. Oh, one black kid in my class. His name was Marvin. And he was the worst behaved one in class. I wonder why. Maybe school doesn't work for him. Or maybe he had this teacher. Would I ever have known? I found out by accident. Democracy would have demanded that I acknowledge the experiences of other people, not as problems to solve, but as the other half of my own. I could never have imagined what it was like being in that classroom, except what it was like to be me in that classroom. Man, that's some sharp edges. That's not like, well, let's vote, right? It's about sitting down and going, what's your experience? Here's mine. Here's what I want. What do you want? What do you need? What do I need? What does your child need? And here's where it gets complicated because we think that's hard. It's so hard to listen to people who sound dumb to us. But it gets even harder when we're talking about people we don't even know yet. Look now, your kids. So what democracy demands is not just that we listen, but we measure our own experiences and needs and wants against those of others. It means that not just that we wait for other people to tell us what their experiences and wants and needs are, but that we solicit. And it doesn't just mean that we compromise, it means that we move. It means we might actually want something else, need something else. Democracy demands an education of our imagination. That's the reason to do it. Yes?
Would it be safe to say that democracy, that it needs empathy? I feel like that's what you're
That it needs empathy. Did y'all hear that? Would it be safe to say that democracy needs empathy? It sounds great to me. I mean, I know that sounds a little like casual, but yeah, like at least, right? Being able to, maybe this. It demands empathy if it's not just, empathy often means like trying to imagine standing in another person's shoes, but it also demands a kind of relationship where you're invited to stand in another person's shoes, right? Because often we go, oh, I can imagine what it's like for you, but we can't really do that fairly until we have that exchange. So I just don't know what else to call that. If I had another name besides democracy, we could have skipped this whole lecture about what democracy isn't, about all the words we use, what it's against. We could have just said this thing. But the best word so far is democracy. And empathy is a quality that might facilitate it, or it might demand empathy. It might demand trust. It demands stamina. Because, man, sometimes it's just easier. Can we just make a decision? And I'm not saying democracy is the way to handle every decision. This argument is not democracy or nothing, democracy or bust. This is about, this is a way to think about democracy and to value it for other reasons besides some abstract principles of government, that it's better than having drug lords rule your country. If you can think of another name to call this, it's better than democracy, this kind of give and take, this kind of encounter, please, let's find it. But for now, this is what we mean when we say democracy. There's a couple hands. Yes? Please don't put your stuff together. We'll be out of here in a couple minutes, but let me get a couple questions if there are any. Yes? Democracy is a dialectic. It's perfect. It's actually just right. When I've considered that term, what happens is that the word dialectic, in my own experience, comes from most people located in a Marxist tradition, right? The problem is, all you've got to say to make sure that at least half of the country stops listening to you is say you've read Karl Marx, right? Because then you get like, what, are you some kind of communist? Right? If I ever was going to have a political career, it got torpedoed when one of my co-authors on a paper decided to cite Karl Marx. I thought, well, there goes my political career. All I got to do is find that article and I get called a Marxist. But yeah, the process that's described by dialectic is much like the process that I'm describing here with the word democracy. Sounds about right.